Hopefully that works. All right, heads up, I am a little tired, but we'll see. So give it a little intro, all that jazz. Oh, nice. I thought I went through and fixed this earlier. I guess not that closely. All right. So yeah, I'll give like a little recap. Last time we did CSS, we showed you how you can select different parts of your site and give it some styling and different colors and all that kind of jazz. We made our site a little bit nicer. We used some new HTML tags to split up our code into different sections. And then we discovered hovering, and we did some cool stuff with like rainbow effects. And that was how last week went. If you have any questions about that, definitely talk to a TA. You can find the starter code, the lecture code on our Discord server in the resources channel. It'll link to our GitHub, and you can go into each week and find it there. Today, we're going to look at some Flexbox and do a little bit of JavaScript. Next week, we're going to do Git and a very basic intro to React. And then week 5 is when we're going to start to build out this final version of our club site using just React, and eventually we'll introduce a backend and all that kind of jazz. But today we're going to do a little bit more CSS, introduce you to JavaScript because it's what we use for React, and that's kind of our goal for today. So we're going to start with some Flexbox. Developers use it because it lets you dynamically style your site in a way, sort of. It lets you create a semi-responsive design. So your site will sort of scale to whatever screen you're on. So this could let you make the same site for maybe a mobile web browser as well as potentially the desktop. And you don't have to sort of switch to a mobile view kind of thing. We use Flexbox. It makes it easy to sort of distribute that space, align content on our site, etc. And we quickly just need to define some words for it. So if you just look on the left, we sort of have a container, which is sort of like the outer div if we were thinking back to last time. And so all of our Flexbox sort of items are going to be within that container. And so throughout today, when we sort of say container and item, this is these images on the left are what we're referring to. By using those terms, we can begin to look at potentially an example of using Flexbox. And if we open up club1.html, we'll find just this like starter code called flex.html, and this just has the base of an HTML file set up where we have these classes defined, one for container and one for item. And once again, that container and item is referencing to this sort of picture on the left side where we have an outer box and then items within it. And so that's the exact same thing that we've created with this div here. And if we actually go ahead and open that file up, you'll notice that we have some boxes, and right now they just say the word content in them. And the styling for that was defined within this style.css file, right? So we're grabbing the body and we're making the font bigger, and then we're selecting these based off their classes and just adding some borders so that you can sort of see what's actually going on here. So the most important part of sort of this example is that within our style.css file, we have defined display flex. And that allows our container element to actually be a Flexbox. If we remove this display flex, and if we save our file and head back to our web browser, we'll notice that if we refresh, this just displays stuff in the sort of box format like we had been using previously, where just one element per line, and it just sort of goes top to bottom. So adding display flex is how we actually got a Flexbox to show up on our page. But for now, the Flexbox is just putting the items beside each other based off of sort of their space, and that's sort of how it does it by default. And this doesn't really seem that important yet, but if we, for example, grab this other div here, which had a bunch of just random text in it, and if we save our page and if we refresh it here, you'll notice that because I'm zoomed in, this looks a little bit funny, but you'll notice that these flex boxes change in size in order to sort of fill all of the text. It will make more space for the additional text, and if we actually grab our web browser window here and make it larger or smaller, the website will actually adjust to the size of our screen. And that's sort of the beauty of Flexbox. That's why we're showing you it at all, is because it will actually change based off of the content within it. And once we get to doing React and other things like that, we might not actually write out all of the content for our website directly into the HTML page. Maybe it'll be found somewhere else in a file, etc. And so that's why Flexbox is really great for us developers. The first thing that you may think of is, hey, what if we want to change sort of the direction that these items are set up in, or maybe we want to change like their ordering kind of. And so the first thing that we can do for that is, first I'll go back to just the three little items to make this a little bit easier to see. And if we head over to our style page, we can actually change the flex direction. And there's a bunch of options for this, but the main ones are row and column. And if we put it in column here, and if we refresh the page, we'll see that our items sort of are on top of each other, like they were in the previous display formats. We also have row, which if we type that in, that's actually the default for Flexbox. It just puts them in a row here. And there's two other ones. One is row reverse and one is column reverse, and that just takes the items and sort of reverses them. And Flexbox is kind of just like other CSS in that most of the time it's a great idea for you to sort of say, hey, how do I do this thing with Flexbox? And you'll get some great documentation online on how that actually works. We can also sort of allow our items to have a wrap ability. And if you don't know what that means, that's sort of like in Notepad, where if you type a ton in Notepad and you don't have word wrap on, you'll actually get a sort of a scroll bar to show up. Let me see if I can quickly show you. So if I do view and if I turn off word wrap, you'll see that sort of like a scroll bar shows up and you have to scroll across. It's very similar for Flexbox elements, and probably the best way to show you this is to just grab one of these really massive items with a ton of text and put it at the start. And so if we refresh our page now, we'll see that this massive item takes up a bunch of space, and now we have these content ones that have this long sort of vertical space that makes it look a little bit weird. But if we instead head over to our style page, and if we say flex wrap and we turn it on to wrap and refresh the page, we'll see that, hey, our first our first item, which is extremely long, was able to take up some more space, and then the additional items were able to wrap on to like a new line, and it allows it to sort of look a little bit prettier. It sort of allows the items to kind of flow better together, if that sort of makes sense. We can also define the item's order to change how they're sort of spaced out. So if we look at the justify content side on the right hand side there, we can sort of center things, we can put some space between them, and we can do all of these things in order to change the way that the items within our container are actually laid out. So one of these examples would be we could change the justify content to flex end, and if we refresh the page, we'll realize that all of the items sort of start on the right hand side instead of the left hand side. And if we get rid of this massive item here, you'll be able to see it much better, and all of our items within this container start on the right side instead of starting on the left side. There's a few more. We have something like center, which will put them, of course, at the center, and we have space between, which will evenly distribute them. And there's a bunch of these, and the best thing for you to do is probably to look the rest of them up. The documentation will definitely tell you what they do. So far we've done flex direction, which essentially allows you to make your Flexbox either vertical or horizontal by changing it between row and column. We've done flex wrap, which determines whether we want our Flexbox to be able to sort of wrap onto a new line and take up some more vertical space. And then we've done justify content, which sort of defines how the items are spaced out with each other, sort of horizontally. We can also go even further, and we can say align items, which is actually how they're aligned sort of vertically. It's slightly different from the justify content, but we can think of this as the exact same thing except vertical. And one of the ways that we can do this is we can say, hey, we want to make these centered vertically. And if we refresh the page, nothing's going to happen because all of these items are too small. But if we add back in some of these long ones, you'll see that our Flexbox here is going to nicely align everything in the vertical center. We probably want to get rid of our wrapping to show that better, but you'll see that everything is centered vertically, right? All of these contents in the middle have an equal amount of space above and below them. And funnily enough, this leads us to one of the funniest questions in sort of front-end web development, and that is your classic, how do you center a div? And this is one of the ways that you can actually do it. If you have your justify content set to the center, and if you have your aligned items set to the center, something will be centered within your div by using a Flexbox. And I'm sure you'll find one or more instance where this doesn't really work out for you, but most of the time this is a pretty good way of centering things. So that's sort of like a brief introduction to Flexbox. You can do so much more, but in interest of not boring you, we're probably going to stop here. You can check out CSS Tricks, has a great website on Flexbox, and they have a bunch of diagrams, some of which we've even stolen for our presentation. There's also a neat site called Flexbox Froggy, which will let you go through sort of all of these different Flexbox items in sort of an interactive way where you actually type in the answer, click next, and it continues to go through this little game with a frog. But our goal today was to mostly show you Flexbox and sort of tell you why you should be using it and why it's so powerful. And instead of asking you to memorize these things, we want you to consider using Flexbox the next time you're trying to sort of align elements within your website. We can go back to sort of our code here, and we can head into Club 2, and if we actually go down to our footer here, we can see an example of Flexbox being actually used. And so if we open up our site here, we'll see at the bottom of our page, we're actually using a Flexbox in order to align these elements. And so you'll see here we have the outer div, which becomes the container, and in this case we're using a class of footer container. And then we have the inner items, which in the last example were each divs, but in this case they're just links. And so we're giving each of them the ID of footer container item, and then in our styles sheet for the Club 2, you'll notice that we select all of the footer. I think it was footer container. Yeah, we select the footer container, and we give it a display of flex, and then we select the footer container item, and we also assign a little bit of styling to them too. But generally, the container here has flex, and we're saying, hey, the flex direction is row. And that is how we actually got these links to be aligned like this at the bottom of our site. You can see how they are, you can see their individual spaces if you open the sort of inspect page, and you can select the outer one to see your Flexbox container. And so there's a very small example on how you can actually use Flexbox on your site. We're also using Flexbox to display these sort of boxes here with the cool human facts and the table as well, but you can check the code at the end for exactly how that's working, but it all follows sort of the same, making a container and then adding items within it and then changing the container slightly so that stuff is displayed the way that we want it to be. From here, we're going to actually switch and pivot a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit about JavaScript. It is a programming language that's pretty similar to Python. If you're doing any web development, you've probably run into JavaScript at some point, and it actually allows you to make your web page a bit more interactive. It allows you to sort of change things on the fly. But for now, we're going to give you a really brief introduction to JavaScript. If you've done Python before, this will feel very similar. If you have no prior programming experience, then this is actually going to seem a little bit confusing, unfortunately, because we based this off of some prior knowledge with Python. And so if you're in that boat, you can find a ton of online resources for how to learn JavaScript completely from scratch. You can talk to either myself or any of the TAs at the end of the lesson, but suffice to say, we're going to give you a brief introduction to JavaScript. And one of the first things that you have to know with JavaScript is it's just like CSS in that you have to actually link your JavaScript back to your HTML file. And so if we go ahead and start to get that set up, we'll create a new folder and we'll call it Club3, and we're going to grab our previous code pages. We might as well reuse them, and we'll paste them into Club3, and then we're going to create our very first JavaScript file by creating a new file, and we're going to call it script.js. So all JavaScript files end with the .js extension, similarly to how CSS ends in .css and HTML, etc. In here, excuse me. In here, we're just going to type one quick line just to see how this actually works, how we actually put these files into our HTML. So we're going to start by just typing alert, and we are going to type some text in here. So I'm just going to say hello. And if you've done Python before, this will look very similar to a function call. If you haven't, for now, just realize that, hey, I'm just typing something in here that I know what it will do, so that I can show you that this is actually working on our website. From here, we are going to have to actually link our JavaScript file to our HTML file, because if we actually go to our Club3 folder, and if we open club.html, nothing different actually happens. Right? So if we actually look back here, we have to link it in a very similar way to how we linked CSS. So we're going to go into our club.html page. We're going to go just to the top of the body for today, and we're going to say, hey, script. And script is just like the style tag, except for JavaScript. And we're going to actually provide it with our script's information. And so to do that, we have to give it a source. And so in this case, we're going to say script.js is the source, and that's just like how it was for CSS. And if we save this file and then refresh our website, we'll notice that before our website even really loads, we get this little alert box that says hello. And it turns out the alert function in JavaScript actually creates this alert message box. And you'll probably have seen this before, asking if you want to confirm something or etc. And this is how that web developer has actually made that happen. And if we click OK, our website will actually load up here. From here, we're going to just do some very basics with JavaScript. One of the first things that you're probably going to want to do is define some sort of variable. And JavaScript is just like Python in that it's a dynamically typed language. There are three main ways for you to sort of create a variable, and the first one is var, and so that sort of stands for variable. Then you provide the name, an equal sign, of course, and then you can provide what you want that variable to be. So maybe I make this 142. You can also use let, so I can say let y equals maybe 65, and you can also say const, and let's say z equals 99. And so const stands for constant, and it means that that variable actually won't change. It can only be defined once. Then var and let will both let you change the actual value of your variable, right? If I later go and say y equals 69, this is actually valid code. The difference between var and let we'll get to later, but if you've done Python before, then know that var is sort of like a global variable, whereas let is more local. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, that's okay. Just know for now that if you define a variable using var or let, you're allowed to change it later, and if you define one using const, you're not allowed to change it. From here, we're probably going to want to actually do something with these variables, right? So we're probably going to want to introduce some sort of expression, maybe like some sort of logic, and JavaScript's a little bit weird with this. Of course, we have our basic math, right? Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division in the top left there. and we have our comparisons just like in Python, right, greater than, less than, etc. But the weird one is that we have two versions of sort of our is this equal. And the weird thing with JavaScript is we can use two equal signs, or we can actually use three. And the difference between them is if I use two equal signs and I say maybe the string 1 equals 1, then this will actually evaluate to true. And if I use three equal signs, then this actually will evaluate to false. And of course, typing it out like this means you just have to take my word for it. But if I actually do console.log, which is the equivalent of the print statement in Python, I can actually type these, print these values out to the console. And so if I grab these from before and put them into two console.log statements, once again, this is sort of the equivalent of printing them out. I can save my file, and if I refresh my site, if I refresh my site and also go back into Club and import that script, there we go. You can see it's right here. If I refresh my site and if I go to inspect, I can open the console window, which is one that we haven't looked at before, and you'll actually see the results of those two Boolean expressions. And it turns out what I was telling you was indeed true. If you use two equal signs, it just checks if they're sort of the same thing, whereas three equal signs checks that they're the exact same thing. And it actually turns out that going into Inspect Element and clicking this Console tab will give you the equivalent of the sort of Python interactive environment where you can actually just type JavaScript directly into here. So if I were to say a var x equals 42, and then if I were to say console.log x, we'll actually get 42 back. And so this is a good way for maybe, hey, you don't want to set up a JavaScript file and import it into HTML. You can actually just type some of your commands in here and see what they actually do. Excuse me. From here, we'll realize that, hey, we probably want to do some sort of comparison, some sort of conditional, and so JavaScript's main ones are if and switch. And if you've never done switch statements before, just think of them as a long line of if statements, and we're mostly just going to focus on sort of if statements. And I mean, of course, we can write a simple little if statement in JavaScript. We can say something like if x is equal to y, then hey, we'll print out hello. And otherwise, we'll use else and we'll print out maybe bye. And so you'll notice that we have parentheses around sort of our statement. And of course, if this evaluates to true, then we'll head into these curly braces and we'll print out hello to our console window. And otherwise, if this is not true, then we'll print out bye into our console window. And if we save this and if we refresh, of course, we'll see that bye is printed out into the console because x is up here is 42 and y is up here, it's 69, and those are not equal. And so if you're getting a bit confused at this point, that's okay. We're aiming for this to be an overview of JavaScript, assuming that you know another programming language. And if that isn't you, definitely ask myself or one of the TAs for help after. We'll go over this in a lot more detail, but there are also a ton of other resources online that you can find. But from here, we can also continue on, and we can say one of the last few things that we probably want access to is probably an array, or the equivalent of a list in Python. And we can define one by using those same square brackets that we use in Python. And so we can say, hey, I want a constant, which means I can't change it later, and I'm going to call it fruit, and I'm going to set it equal to an array, and I can have some starting values in here if I want by typing in maybe some strings, and I'll say maybe apple, banana, and orange. There are a ton of built-in JavaScript functions that sort of will help you out with dealing with arrays. So, for example, one of them would be maybe .toString, and that will actually convert this array to a string. And there's a bunch of these, and I highly suggest before you try to do something with an array, you probably want to look up to see if there's something already implemented to do that. So of course we can log out that, and that will convert our array into a string. We also know that all of these arrays have a .length, option, which tells you how long it is. We have a bunch of others. We can pop, which means we can grab the last value of our array and return it, as well as remove it. So this line will remove orange from the end of the array, and then it will print out orange because it will return that value. And all of this is probably a little bit faster than the first time you want to be learning arrays, but if you've learned them before, then this probably makes a lot of sense. This is probably very similar to what you would type in Python. From here, one of the last things that we want to look at is probably for loops. We want to actually loop through a list of things, and we can define a simple for loop in JavaScript in, albeit a little bit of a cryptic way, by saying for, and then we need some sort of variable to loop with. So I'm going to say let, and then I'll say step equals 0. And so this is sort of the equivalent. If I were to open up a second file here and show you side by side, we're going to write the equivalent Python loop going from 1 to 4, right? So we want to print 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so in Python, we would just say, hey, for I in range 5, right, let's print out I, right? This is the equivalent in Python, but in JavaScript, we're going to start with this variable called step. And if I sort of update my Python code to be similar, right, this I is really step in this case. And so we're going to set step equal to 0, and then from there we're going to say, hey, if step is less than 5, then we're going to continue on with our loop. And then the last thing that we're going to do is say, hey, at the end of every loop, we want to increment step by 1. So we're going to set step equal to step plus 1. Of course, there's your nice syntax to do that in other ways. Of course, you can do step plus plus, etc. But for here, we're going to type it out explicitly just because it makes it a little bit easier. Then we're going to open up our curly braces, and of course we have our classic for loop. So we can do something in here. For today, I'm just going to say console.log step, just so that we can see what it's doing. And if we actually head back over to our site and refresh the page, we'll see that it prints from 0 to 4. And once again, what's actually happening here is we're setting a variable called step. We're setting it equal to 0. And then we're checking, hey, is step less than 5? Well, it is. So we're going to go into sort of the body of our for loop, and we're going to print out the value of step. Then, because everything's done, we're going to increment step by 1, and so step is equal to 1 now. And then we'll say, hey, is step less than 5? Of course it is. And so we'll print it out, and we'll increment, and we'll do that until step is not less than 5. JavaScript also has a ton of ways for defining functions. And so in Python, generally, you would say def, right, to define a function, and you would call that function maybe area. Maybe you would accept a length and a width, and maybe we would return the length multiplied by the width, right? That's how you would define an area function in Python. And weirdly enough, JavaScript has a few ways for you to define a function. And I'm only going to show you them all because maybe you'll look at some documentation online, or you'll look up a solution to a problem that you have, and you'll run into one of these ways that you haven't seen a function be defined before and get a bit confused. So the first one is using straight up the word function, right? And this is going to tell our web browser that we're going to define a function, and I'm going to call it area1 because we want to calculate the area. Of course, we can accept some parameters, right? Width and height is probably what we want. We can open up our curly braces, and we can, of course, return the width multiplied by the height, right? This looks very similar to the example in Python, and that is going to work. And we can also do this in another way, right? We can define a constant, and we can call it maybe area2, and we can set that equal to a function, right? So maybe we call it function area of something, and we accept, once again, a width and a height, and then we are going to return that width times that height. And now it turns out if we call area2, it will actually work the same as if we called this function area of something sort of without this assignment. And so on first glance, you'd think, why would we ever do that? But it turns out this will actually allow us to pass around functions and sort of give them to things, if that makes a little bit of sense. And we'll do that a lot more with React, but for now, let's just say that this is another way that we can define a function. And sort of the third way, of course there are more, but the third way is actually using what's called an arrow function. And what that actually means is we set it equal to, and then we just create some parentheses, we create sort of this arrow, and then we open up curly braces. And this on its own is an entire function. And so this would be the equivalent to just creating a function, giving it a name, and then not having it do anything. Except we're sort of assigning it to this variable, and so that's why it doesn't have a name yet. So then within these parentheses, we can define sort of our parameters, right? We can define width and we can define length, and then within these curly braces, we can define what we want our function to do, of course, and we can say return width times height, and it turns out that this is another valid way of creating a function. And so if I go ahead and if I print out area 1, and if I print out area 2, and if I print out area 3, these will all produce the exact same value. So if I refresh my page and run that script, of course, they all produce 50. We're going to briefly mention that JavaScript works on an object-based system named JSON. That it might be a bit confusing to you, but we can think of JSON as just a Python dictionary, right? And so to give you an example of it, I could maybe say, hey, I'm going to ask for a name, and it will be Josh, and I will ask for maybe a program, and it will be computer science, and then maybe I'll ask for an age, and it will be 19. And so this right here, of course, my code editor is going to yell at me because I haven't done this completely properly. I haven't assigned this to anything. But we can define JSON by just opening up some curly braces and then giving it some sort of keys and values. And that's the exact same way that we would do it in Python, right? This same thing could actually just be, hey, I create a person, right? And then we create our dictionary. And we would say, hey, name is Josh, and we'd say program is computer science, and we would say, hey, age is 19. And it looks like I forgot my, there we go. And so that is the equivalent in Python, but Java sort of works on this system of JSON, and essentially it's key and value links, right? It's a dictionary. We provide the value name, and then we get back Josh, and et cetera, et cetera. So your next question might be like, why did we learn all of this JavaScript? It's quite a lot of time, and most of it was kind of just review of Python, right? Like, this doesn't really seem like it was that useful, but it turns out that we can use all of the stuff that we've learned in JavaScript and actually use it to slightly change our site. And so if we create sort of a new folder here, we'll call it Club 4, and if we grab our sort of previous club website, copy it over to Club 4 here, if we open that up, we'll notice that it's just our usual club website, right? Everything's fine. We haven't actually changed anything. So let's first, as we have before, let's create a script.js file so that we can write some HTML within there. And we're actually going to create something for our Contact Us page. So if we head into contact.html, we're actually going to first link our script to our Contact Us page. And so the way that we're going to do that is we are going to go into sort of the head of our HTML page, and we're going to say, hey, script. And we're actually going to write defer, which means that we want the script to load after the page is loaded. If you remember with some of the previous examples, especially with the alert box, if we refresh the page, when we load the page, the alert box actually showed up before the rest of the page did. And we can see that if we head back to Club 3, and if we open it up, and then if we add back our alert box that we got rid of at the very top of our page, if we say alert hi, and if we save it and refresh, we'll notice that the alert box loads before the page actually loads. And we don't want that to happen for this script. So in this case, we're using that defer keyword. And that's exactly what that does, is it waits for the body of the script to, the body of the page, sorry, to load before we actually start doing anything in terms of JavaScript. Then we're of course going to give it its source, and in this case that is script.js. So now we've linked our script to our HTML page. And so if we go back here and if we go into Club 4 and open up our Contact Us page, we'll see that nothing has really changed, right? This is just a styled version of the contact page that we looked at last time. From here, we're going to try to actually select some of the items that we found on our HTML page. And remember last time we said, hey, all of your form values, you should probably give those an ID so that you can select them later. And we can actually get a value from our form using something called a query selector. And so if we head over to our HTML, we'll realize that, hey, we have all of this stuff at the beginning which we don't really care about, and here's our form right here, right? And our form has an ID of contact-form. And so we're going to head back over to our JavaScript and we're going to say, hey, I want to grab the form. So I'm going to create a constant called form. And then what we can say is document.querySelector, and we are going to tell it what we want to select. And in this case, we want to select the form. So we're going to say, hey, I want to grab the form. And unfortunately, this works just like CSS, in that if we want to grab something based off of its ID, we have to add a hashtag to the beginning. So now, in theory, this script right here will actually grab our form. And if we, of course, we can open up our inspect, and if we open up console and refresh the page, nothing really seems to happen. So we can maybe try printing out this form value and see what it does. If we do that, we'll see, hey, we've got some HTML being printed out to our console window, and hey, this looks like our form, right? It has all of our form items in it, and we can open this up and see them all. And so, hey, we probably know that we've selected our form from here. So a quick recap of that, we can use a document.querySelector and then some amount of sort of CSS selection within here in order to select things that are on our HTML page. Now that we've grabbed the elements sort of our form, we can actually start to see if our form maybe has proper input, right? Maybe we want to check to see that the name is long enough, or that the email address has a period in it, etc., etc. And so the first thing that we have to do is we have to tell our JavaScript to know when we've actually submitted the form, right? So first I'm going to comment out this line, and then I'm going to say, hey, I want to find out when the form has been submitted. So I'm going to grab my form, and then I'm going to say, hey, I want to listen for when I've clicked the submit button. So I can say add event listener. And then it's going to say, hey, well, what do you want to listen for, right? What do you want to wait to happen? And I'm going to wait for the form to be submitted. So I'm going to type in submit. And then I have to define what happens when I submit. So I'm going to define a function, and I'm going to call it submit. And it's going to not accept anything for now, and then here I'll define it with using its curly braces, right? So if I split this off onto a new line, right, we've defined a function called submit, and that's what's actually going to happen when the submit button is clicked. So if I maybe within here say console.log submit and refresh our page over here, if I click the submit button, you'll notice very, very briefly, and if I turn on preserve log up here, which means that the console window doesn't clear when you refresh the page, if I click the submit button, you'll realize that submit is printed out to the console window. And so now we know that we're actually listening for the submit button to be pressed, right? So we're grabbing our form, we're adding an event listener, we're looking for it to submit, and then when it does submit, we're calling this function, and this function just prints out the word submit for now. From here, it turns out that we can actually learn a little bit more about our submission, and that is by providing the event as a parameter. And so the first value that the event listener will give you is its event, and we can actually use that to sort of get at the values of our form. So we can use sort of the names that we defined before. So if we head over to contact.html, remember that all of our inputs actually have a name. And I said, hey, you should probably do this for best practice, but here is one of the reasons why that we've actually done that. So if I get rid of this console.log, I can now say, hey, I want to get at the name, this sort of input box here. And if I grab my selector and sort of select it, I'll realize that, hey, it has the name of name. So if I want to get at that, I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to define a variable. I'm going to call it maybe name, I guess. And I'll say, hey, I want to grab this event, which is me submitting the form. And then I want to say .target, which is going to sound a little bit weird, but we're actually going to look at the form's sort of values, or more specifically, we're looking at the actual event object, but that sounds a little bit weird. So for now, just think of this as, hey, we're going to target the actual values of the form. Then I need to say what value I want. So I want the name, so I'm going to say name. And then I'm going to say, hey, this part's a little bit weird, but we want the value of name, right? We don't just want to select name, right? Because that would be like selecting the form. We want the actual value, right? We want the name, so I'm going to say .value. And so if I say console.log name, if I save this and if I refresh my page and head over to the console, nothing will happen, and that's because we haven't submitted our form, right? This event listener waits for us to submit the form before it will call this function. So if I fill out my form here by giving myself a name of this is a name, maybe an email, and then maybe a message, I'll select one of these buttons. If I click submit, you'll see, hey, our submit function actually printed out this is a name, and it grabbed that name by using this event target, and then of course printing out that variable. From here, we can do this a few more times, right? We can get at our name, but we can also get at the email, right? And if we change this very slightly just to grab the email, we can also use this to get at maybe the message, right? That's that big text box on the left there, right? We'll change this for message. And the last thing that we can get at is sort of these buttons on the bottom, right? And we're going to call that we call that experience, and so we're going to grab the experience. Right? And remember that this third value is the name of the input field on our HTML page, right? So here is the input for the name, and here's for the email, and down here is for the message, and of course there's one more for the experience. From there, we could decide to print all of these values out to make sure that they work, right? So we could say a console.log, maybe name, email, message, and experience. Right, and if we put commas between them, don't worry, it's kind of like Python in that JavaScript, we'll just print them out with a space between them, right? So if I select all these and if I hit submit, we'll see, hey, look, all of our values are working, right? They're all here, our name, our email, our message, and our experience. So for now, we've just grabbed some values that are actually on our form, and we're doing that whenever we submit the form. The next thing that we're going to want to do is figure out a way to actually, here, give me one sec. There we go. Sorry, I just had to mute the sky for a second. So from there, we're going to actually use some of these values to see if people are submitting the form correctly. So the first thing that we're going to say is, hey, if our name value is maybe a blank string, right? If they didn't enter anything, then we want to say, hey, maybe we want to send out a message to console, right? So we'll say console.log bad name, right? And so if we refresh our page here, if we leave the name field blank, and if we say maybe type in an email, type in a message, select one of these and hit continue, we'll see, hey, bad name gets sent out to console because we didn't, of course, provide a name. The next thing that we're going to want to do is, hey, maybe we want to show, maybe we want to show this somewhere on the site, right? We want to tell the user that, that they've provided a bad name, right? And so the one way that we can do that is we can actually update a part of our site. And so if we head back over to contact.html, you'll notice that at the very top of our sort of contact form, we're going to want to create something in order to sort of hold these errors, right? And so we can create a div maybe, and we'll give it maybe a class of errors, and we'll just leave it blank for now, right? And so if we go back and if we refresh our page, of course nothing will happen because there's no content within it. The next thing that we can do is, instead of making a log to console, we can instead actually change sort of the value of that. So we can first, we need to actually get that error element, right? So we want to say constant, and we want to grab, maybe we'll call it error spot, right? And so we want to say, of course, document.querySelector like we had before, and we want to grab something sort of with the ID of, let's say, error. And so if we go back over to our div here, we're going to give this an ID of error. And that's not going to do anything quite yet, right? This is just like how we had selected the form before. Now we actually have to do something with it. And so the first thing that we're going to say is, hey, error spot. We're going to maybe say, hey, we want to define some styling. So we're going to say .style, and oops, we're going to say .style, and then we're going to say .display, and we're going to set that to inline. And this is just going to make sure that it shows up. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, maybe we want to make the text different, right? Right now the text is just a blank string, but now we could maybe make the text, you didn't include a name, exclamation mark, right? And if we save this and if we refresh, we'll see, hey, if we don't include a name, and then we fill out an email address, and then we give a message, and we select this and we hit submit, we realize, hey, look, something showed up at the very top of our screen, but only for a split second. And you'll notice that our form is now clear again, and that's probably not what we want to happen, right? We probably want our form's values to stay there because we want the user to change their input, right? We want them to fix it. So if I go back up to the top here, I can say, I can grab my event, and I can call this prevent default function. And what that actually does is that it prevents what our form would do by default. And we saw last week that by default, when we submit the form, it actually refreshes the page. And so if I sort of reload here, and if I type some stuff in, of course not including a name, we can then see our error message will show up at the top here, and it will say you didn't include a name. So we can continue to do this for a bunch of different sort of errors, right? We could check for an email address having a period in it and maybe an @ symbol. We could check that maybe the message isn't blank. And we could check that they've selected an experience button, right? We could check all of these things off. And if we actually go into sort of our final version of this script, we can actually see here that all of those things have been defined, right? So here's once again us grabbing our form, and then we're adding that event listener. In this case, we've defined it using an arrow function, but that's the exact same as what we did last time, right? We grabbed all of our name, email, message, experience. Once again, we're grabbing our error element here, and in this case, we've done it in a slightly different way that allows us to have multiple errors at once, right? So we've set up an array called messages, and then every time we check for something, right, in this case we're checking if the name is an empty string or if it wasn't provided, we send an error message sort of to this array here, right, this array called messages, and it turns out that the push function does exactly that. It appends something to the end, and it's the same thing as .append in Python. And so we'll continue to do that for all of the different things, right? We check to see that an email has been provided. And then we check to see if the email has an @ symbol or a period symbol, of course, because an email should have those things. And then we check if the message is blank. And then we check if the experience is blank. And after we've done all of those things, we then check, hey, do we have an error message at all, right? And so the way that we would check that is if there are any messages in the messages array. And so we've checked the length, and we've said if it's larger than 0, then hey, we're going to do this prevent default thing that we did before, and we're going to set the same styling that we did before, and then we're going to say, hey, we're going to set the text to messages.join with a colon, or sorry, with a comma. And that may seem a bit weird, but all that .join does is it actually grabs each element of an array, and it will separate them sort of by a comma. So I can give you a quick example here. If I maybe define an array called x, and if I give it maybe hi and bye, if I then say x dot join, and if I give it a colon, you'll see here printed, it grabs the first element, it gives it a colon, and then it grabs the second element. And so if I actually load up this version of the site, our sort of final version of our club website for this week, and if I fill in, maybe I'll fill in no name, and maybe I'll fill in hi at GG, and then maybe I'll fill in, no message and no experience. If I click submit, we'll see that, hey, look, name is required, comma, email is missing, sort of a period in this case, and then it'll say, comma, message is required, comma, experience rating required. And that's sort of the power of that join statement. It's adding a comma between every single one of the messages that was appended to this array, and each message was appended to this array based off of the values of our form. And you'll notice, even more importantly, the values of our form that we've already filled out are still there. So if we then fix our work and we maybe actually fill this form out correctly, and if we click submit, it'll then reset. It'll say, hey, look, you only don't have a period in your email. And so now if I add my .com here, and if I actually submit the form, you'll see that the form was actually properly submitted. And so this week was a little bit different from our previous weeks. We didn't spend all that much time actually working on our club site, but we wanted to introduce you to Flexbox, tell you a little bit about why you should probably use it, and give you some base knowledge in JavaScript, because we're going to be moving into React next week, which is sort of a JavaScript-based language. And once again, I highly suggest that you try to implement some of these things on a personal site. Maybe you can use some JavaScript in order to have a button click, and then maybe a number changes on your site. Or maybe you click the button and it counts the amount of times it's been clicked, and you can sort of simulate a little clicker game, like of course the classic cookie clicker of our childhood, in that way. And if you need help doing any of these things, definitely talk to a TA, but you'll realize that actually starting a project is definitely the best way to reinforce this stuff.